The dust of the Tajikistan frontier tasted of rust and regret. It clung to the olive-drab skin of Captain Eva Rostova's A-10 Thunderbolt II, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into every seam and joint. From the cockpit parked at the edge of the forward operating base's bustling flight line, she watched the F-16s scream into the sky, their afterburners tearing violent, perfect holes in the pale canvas of dusk. They were the scalpels, the glorious streaks of silver and speed. Her aircraft, the Warthog, was a sledgehammer. It was low, slow, and ugly, built around a gun that fired 30 mm depleted uranium shells at a rate that sounded like God-ripping fabric. Her call sign was Valkyrie, an ironic moniker given to her by pilots who flew twice as high and twice as fast. To them, she wasn't a mythical chooser of the slain, but a glorified bus driver, a glorified female bus driver circling the battlefield long after the real dogfighting was done. Eva never acknowledged the slight. She didn't need to. Her quiet confidence was its own armor forged in countless hours of simulated and real-world ground support missions, where precision was measured not in miles, but in meters from a friendly position. She ran a gloved hand over the instrument panel, the cold glass of the gauges a familiar comfort. The A-10 wasn't a machine of elegant algorithms and fly-by-wire perfection. It was a beast of hydraulics and raw power, a flying tank that spoke to its pilot through vibration and strain. You didn't command a Warthog, you reasoned with it. You learned its language of groans and shudders, and in return it gave you a survivability no sleek fighter jet could ever match. The cockpit was her sanctuary, a cramped metal cage where the quiet judgment of the airbase mess hall couldn't reach her. Here only skill mattered. A crackle in her headset brought her back. Valkyrie, this is Tower. You're scheduled for a standard patrol pattern grid squares 7 through 9. Overwatch for Operation Silent Arrow. Acknowledged. Tower, Valkyrie. Acknowledged. She responded, her voice calm and even betraying none of the weariness that settled deep in her bones. Operation Silent Arrow. A SEAL Team Trident was deep in the Khorasan mountain range, a jagged spine of rock and shadow that had swallowed armies whole for centuries. Her job was to be a distant, unseen guardian angel, a force in being, as the mission planners called it, a deterrent. It was a milk run, a flight designed to put hours on her airframe and keep her out of the way. As she began her pre-flight checks, the voice of Colonel Davies, the Air Wing commander, cut through the channel from the Tactical Operations Center. His tone was dismissive, meant for the operators around him, but broadcast for all to hear. Just keep her on a long leash, Tower. Don't want her scaring any goats. Ava's jaw tightened, but her hands remained steady on the throttle. She had learned long ago that reacting to such barbs was a waste of energy. Respect, she knew, was not given in a briefing room. It was earned over the radio in the desperate final seconds, when a voice from the ground choked with fear and cordite begged for fire and thunder. With a final check, she pushed the throttles forward. The twin General Electric engines spooled up with a deep, hungry roar that was utterly unlike the shriek of a fighter jet. It was a guttural, ground-shaking sound, a promise. The Warthog lumbered down the runway heavy with fuel and ordnance before lifting gracefully into the air, its ungainly shape, transforming into something purposeful against the dying light. As she banked east towards the mountains, the base shrank behind her, a small island of order in a vast sea of chaos. Alone in the darkening sky, Eva Rostova became Valkyrie, and her vigil began. The ghosts on the wire had not yet begun to scream. Miles below Valkyrie's lonely orbit, the world was a labyrinth of rock and freezing shadow. Here on the ground, the war had a different texture. It was the sharp bite of the wind that funneled through the canyon, the grating sound of shale under a boot, and the oppressive weight of the mountains that seemed to lean in, listening. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne, call sign Trident Lead, felt that weight in his bones. For 2 decades he had made his home in places like this, places men were not meant to be, and he had learned to interpret their silent warnings. His team of 5 moved with the fluid economy of apex predators. They were ghosts in the twilight, their forms blurred by advanced camouflage, their movements precise and synchronized without a single word. They were currently settled into an overwatch position on a high ridge. Their objective a cave mouth half a click away on the opposing slope, a suspected high-level insurgent command bunker and weapons depot. The mission was simple on paper: observe, confirm, and laser designate for a surgical strike at dawn. Simple missions were the ones that killed you. Reaper, what do you see? Thorne's voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the air transmitted through his bone conduction headset. Negative thermal signatures at the entrance lead, came the reply from his sniper tucked into a stone nest 20 meters to his right. But the wind's playing tricks. Could be masking something. It feels quiet. Too quiet. Thorne grunted in acknowledgement. He trusted Reaper's instincts as much as he trusted the man's aim. Too quiet was a cliché for a reason. In the wild places of the world, silence was rarely empty. It was watchful. He raised his own optics, the enhanced imaging turning the deep purple shadows into a world of greens and whites. He scanned the layered rock of the far cliff face, meticulously tracing every crack and crevice. The intelligence said the enemy was complacent, believing this valley impenetrable. Intelligence, Thorne knew, was often just the first casualty of contact with reality. He keyed his comms for the scheduled check-in with command. Watchtower, this is Trident Lead. Sit rep follows. We are in position, eyes on the objective. All quiet. How copy? The reply was instantaneous. Filtered through layers of encryption, the voice of a controller sitting in a comfortable chair hundreds of miles away. Solid copy, Trident. Weather is holding, but a low-pressure system is moving in from the north. Valkyrie is on station for Overwatch, call sign Valkyrie 1. Be advised her station time is limited. Thorne glanced reflexively at the sky, though he knew he would see nothing. An A-10, a slow, noisy gunship, not the asset he would have chosen for a stealth operation, but it was what command had given them. He imagined the pilot probably some hotshot captain, bored and impatient, flying lazy circles in the stratosphere. He dismissed the thought. Every piece on the board had a purpose. Acknowledged Watchtower. Will be dark until the morning call. Trident out. He lowered his comms unit and settled back against the rock, the cold seeping through his gear. The feeling returned, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. It was the sixth sense of a hunter who suddenly realizes he might be the hunted. He scanned the ridge above the cave entrance again, slower this time, letting his eyes relax, looking for patterns that were not patterns, for shapes that were not rocks. And then he saw it. It was nothing really. A flicker. A momentary distortion in the air near a cluster of jagged boulders, as if the heat signature of something had been briefly unscreened. It could have been an animal, a gust of wind kicking up warm dust from a sun-baked rock. It could have been nothing. But it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a single discordant note in the symphony of the mountain silence. The ghosts on the wire were starting to whisper, and Marcus Thorne knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind that his team was no longer alone. The stars in the high desert sky were cold and sharp, like shards of scattered glass. From 20,000 feet, Eva could see the curvature of the earth, a serene, majestic arc that belied the brutal geometry of the war below. She listened to the rhythmic hiss of oxygen in her helmet and the steady thrum of the engines, a duet that had become the soundtrack to her life. Trident Lead's voice from his check-in still echoed in her mind, calm, professional, by the book. It was the voice of a man in complete control. And it was that perfect control that worried her. Her mind drifted back to the briefing room that morning, the memory as sharp and unwelcome as the glare of the sun off the salt flats. The air had been chilled to an unnatural cold, a stark contrast to the heat outside. She was the only A-10 pilot in a room of F-16 driver's men who talked in a language of Mach numbers and G-forces their flight suits, adorned with self-important patches. They were the jocks, the aces. She was the mud hen, the pilot of a plane they considered a flying tractor. Colonel Davies had been leading the briefing, pacing before a massive digital map of the Khorasan range. He was a man carved from sharp angles with a clipped, impatient voice that suggested he had little time for nuance. A former F-15 Eagle pilot, he viewed warfare as a vertical enterprise. You achieved dominance from above, swift and clean. The objective is simple. Davies had said, tapping a red circle on the map that represented the valley. SEAL Team Trident goes in, paints the target, and gets out. The strike will be handled by a B-1 Lancer at Show 500. It's a ghost operation. No contact, no trace. Ava had studied the topographical display. The valley was a nightmare, a deep, jagged wound in the earth with steep, overlapping walls. It was a natural fortress, a perfect kill box. She had raised her hand. Colonel, request to speak. Davies's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of annoyance in his gaze. Captain Rostova. Sir. Eva began, her voice steady. That valley offers zero visibility from high altitude. If Trident gets into trouble, a fast mover won't be able to provide effective close air support. I'd like to plot a low-level ingress and egress route just as a contingency. Put my Warthog on a closer hold, ready to respond. A low murmur went through the other pilots. A few of them exchanged smirks. The suggestion was a breach of doctrine. Her role was deterrence, not active engagement. Davies gave a thin, dismissive smile. It was the smile of a man who had already made up his mind and was merely tolerating an interruption. Captain, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Your job is to be a scarecrow, orbiting up in the cheap seats where everyone can see you. You are a psychological asset. This is a scalpel mission, not a bar fight. The SEALs are the best we have. They won't need a sledgehammer. He turned back to the map, a clear dismissal. Stick to the flight plan. The memory faded, leaving a bitter taste. Back in the cold reality of her cockpit, the colonel's words felt foolish and dangerous. He hadn't been making a tactical decision. He had been reinforcing a prejudice. His bias against her slow-moving aircraft, and perhaps its female pilot, had led him to ignore a critical vulnerability in his own plan. He saw her plane as obsolete, a relic. He couldn't comprehend that in the tight, dirty confines of a ground fight, the Warthog's ability to fly low and slow to absorb punishment and deliver overwhelming, precise firepower was exactly what a cornered team of operators would pray for. A quiet anger, cold and controlled, settled in Ava's chest. It wasn't about her pride. It was about the men on the ground, whose lives depended on the cold calculations of commanders who were miles away from the fight. Acting on an instinct, she refused to question. Eva nudged her control stick. The Warthog responded with a gentle, ponderous bank. She deviated from her assigned patrol grid ever so slightly, shaving 10 miles off her distance to the red circle on her map. It was a small act of insubordination, invisible to the tower, a secret between her and her machine. She was no longer just a scarecrow. She was a hunter moving closer to the shadows. The flicker on the ridge resolved itself in Marcus Thorne's optics. It was the sun glinting off the coated lens of a spotting scope. An observer. They had been made. For how long he didn't know, but the quiet valley suddenly felt like the floor of an arena, and his team was the entertainment. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He keyed his internal comms, his voice a blade of ice. Contact. Ridge. We've been... The rest of the word was swallowed by a sound that split the air. A whip crack of displaced atmosphere, followed an instant later by the rifle's report echoing from the canyon walls. It wasn't aimed at a man. The round, impossibly precise, slammed into the team's long-range satellite communications pack, which sat beside their signaler. The unit erupted in a spray of shattered electronics and composite casing. In that single masterful shot, the enemy hadn't tried to kill one of them. They had killed their connection to the outside world. They were alone. An instant later, the trap sprung. From 3 separate concealed positions, the heavy rhythmic hammering of PKM machine guns erupted. The sound was a physical force, a tearing, brutal noise that ripped through the air and chewed into the rocks around them. Muzzle flashes blinked from the dark recesses of the opposite cliff face, and impossibly from a fortified position high above their planned escape route. They were caught in a triangulated crossfire. Contact front, contact right. The calls came disciplined and immediate as the SEALs reacted with instinct born of 1,000 drills. They melted into the scant cover the rocky terrain offered the air around them, alive with the zip and snap of supersonic rounds. The Reaper suppress that nest sector 4. Thorne commanded, his cheek pressed to the cold stock of his rifle. He fired 2 controlled shots at a muzzle flash, the recoil a familiar punch in his shoulder. "Doc, you good?" "Good to go, lead!" the team medic yelled back over the din. "We need to move Fall back to Rally Point Bravo, go," Thorne ordered. Rally Point Bravo was a defensible overhang 100 meters back along the path they had taken. It was their only way out. But the enemy knew that. As the first 2 SEALs broke cover, a series of whistling shrieks announced the arrival of mortars. The shells walked their way up the escape path, detonating with deafening crumps that sent geysers of rock and dirt into the air. The path was gone, obliterated an impassable curtain of fire and shrapnel. They were sealed in. A scream cut through the gunfire. "Joker's hit!" Thorne's blood ran cold. He scrambled over to where his youngest team member was lying, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his leg. Doc was already there, his hands moving with desperate efficiency, pulling a tourniquet from his kit. "It's bad lead femoral artery." Thorne laid down a stream of suppressive fire as Doc worked the grim reality of their situation settling in like a shroud. This wasn't a random ambush. The enemy knew their position, their equipment, and their escape routes. Their intelligence hadn't just been wrong. It had been bait. They had walked into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. He looked at the faces of his remaining men smeared with dirt and sweat, their eyes wide but focused. They were warriors, the best in the world, but they were pinned, bleeding, and alone. He crawled back to the shattered remains of the SATCOM unit, pulling his personal short-range radio from his vest. Its signal was line of sight weak, never intended to reach an aircraft orbiting miles above. But it was all they had left. He shielded the handset with his body, pressed the transmit button, and sent his voice into the ether, a desperate prayer aimed at the empty sky. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Any station, this is Trident Lead. We are compromised. Taking heavy casualties. Grid Kilo 9er7. We are in a trap. I repeat, we are in a trap. We require immediate assistance." The transmission was weak, drowned by the hellish noise of the firefight and broken by the unforgiving rock of the canyon walls. It was a ghost of a signal, a whisper in a hurricane, and as a fresh hail of bullets forced him to duck, Marcus Thorne feared no one was listening. A ghost slipped into Eva's headset, a ragged burst of static that clawed its way through the clean, orderly silence of her cockpit. It wasn't on the command frequency. It was a faint signal bleeding through from a tactical channel, weak and desperate. She instinctively adjusted her receiver, her fingers moving with precision, filtering out the atmospheric hiss until the ghost found a voice. It was fragmented, torn apart by distance and terrain, but the words were unmistakable. Mayday, Trident lead, compromised, trap. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Her own premonition, the one Colonel Davies had so casually dismissed, was now screaming at her in the broken voice of a man about to die. Without a second's hesitation, she keyed her own mic, her transmission cutting cleanly through the official channels. Watchtower, this is Valkyrie 1. I am receiving a broken Mayday transmission on tactical frequency believed to be from Trident lead. Message indicates the team is compromised and caught in a trap at grid Kilo 9er7. Advise. Her call landed like a grenade in the sterile, air-conditioned calm of the Tactical Operations Center. The duty officer's voice snapped with sudden urgency. Stand by, Valkyrie. On the main operations floor, screens began to change. Analysts who had been lazily monitoring patrol routes now moved with frantic purpose. Colonel Davies strode to the central command console, his face a thundercloud. Get me a live satellite feed of Kilo 9er7 now, he barked. And somebody try to raise Trident on their primary channel. The response to the second command came back in seconds. Negative contact, sir. Their SATCOM is offline. The satellite feed flickered onto the main screen, a high-resolution thermal image from a surveillance asset miles overhead. The room fell silent. The image was a nightmare. A tiny cluster of 6 brilliant white friendly heat signatures was huddled amongst a cluster of rocks. Surrounding them, from dozens of points on the valley floor and ridges, was a swarm of enemy signatures, a closing net of impending death. Red icons began to pop up on the tactical overlay as signals intelligence analysts pinpointed the source of the enemy fire. Sir, we have multiple heavy machine gun emplacements. One analyst called out, his voice tight. That's not all, another added, pointing to a different screen. I'm picking up active acquisition signals, short range, consistent with SA-18s. We're looking at multiple manpads teams. Sir, they walked the SEALs into a fully integrated air defense trap. The valley on the map was no longer just a topographical feature. It was a tomb. Davies stared at the screen, the tactical reality washing away any trace of his earlier arrogance. His face was a mask of cold, hard calculation. He was no longer a dismissive bureaucrat. He was a commander faced with an impossible choice. He could send an aircraft in there to try and save a team that was already as good as dead, and in doing so almost certainly sacrifice that aircraft and its pilot. Or he could cut his losses. The math was brutal, unforgiving, and impersonal. He picked up the command microphone, his decision made. His voice, when it came, was devoid of all emotion, a flat, hard instrument of command. It broadcast across the network, clear and absolute in Eva's ears. All stations, this is Watchtower Command. Grid Kilo 9er7 is hereby designated a non-permissive combat environment. An immediate and total no-fly zone is in effect for all air assets. The risk is unacceptable. He paused, his next words directed squarely at her. Valkyrie 1, you are to disengage from this frequency, cease monitoring, and return to your designated patrol route. Immediately. Acknowledge. The order was a physical blow. abandon them. Ava stared through her canopy at the distant dark slash in the earth that was the Khorasan range. The colonel's command was a roar in her ears, but beneath it she could still hear the ghost, the faint rhythmic pop, pop, pop of small arms fire a sound like a dying heartbeat. She had been given a direct lawful order and a choice. On the floor of the valley, the world had shrunk to a 50-meter circle of rock smoke and thunder. Time was measured in the space between heartbeats, in the precious seconds it took to swap a magazine. Marcus Thorne and his men were fighting with the cold, brutal efficiency of cornered wolves, but the hunters were legion, and the cage was shrinking. The rocks that had been their cover were now their tombstone, being chipped away piece by piece by the relentless hail of machine gun fire. "Last mag, Reaper," the sniper called out over their internal comms, his voice strained. He had abandoned his precision rifle for his assault carbine, the close-quarters fighting making long-range shots impossible. "Conserve fire on confirmed targets only." Thorne ordered the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Conserving ammunition was a statement of fact. We are going to die here, but we will make it last as long as possible. The air was thick with the smells of war-hot metal cordite and the coppery tang of blood. The source of that smell was Joker, the youngest on the team, lying pale and still behind the largest boulder. Doc was a frantic shadow over him, one hand pressing a field dressing deep into the wound in his leg, the other trying to start an IV line. "See, it's no good." Lead Doc's voice was a ragged whisper, a private channel of despair amidst the chaos. "The tourniquet isn't enough. He's bleeding out internally. He's going into shock. I need to get him out of here now." Thorne knew what that meant. Without a medevac, Joker's chances were 0. He was already a dead man. The knowledge was a physical weight pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He crawled back to the short-range radio, the slim hope it offered now feeling like a cruel joke. He keyed the mic, shouting to be heard over a fresh burst of automatic fire. "Valkyrie 1, this is Trident Lead. Do you read me? They're boxing us in. We have critical casualties." Only static answered. The silence from the sky was more damning than any refusal. It was the silence of indifference, of abandonment. He could picture the pilot flying lazy, safe circles miles away, following orders oblivious to the hell they were in. The thought ignited a flash of rage which he quickly extinguished. Rage was a luxury he couldn't afford. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the high cliffs in hues of orange and purple, the enemy grew bolder. Figures darted between the rocks at the edge of their perimeter, probing their defenses. The SEALs' return fire was becoming sporadic, the disciplined bursts replaced by single, carefully aimed shots. Each shot was a question, how many more do I have left? Thorne found himself looking at the faces of his men. Their jaws were set, their eyes hard, but he saw the exhaustion, the knowledge of the inevitable. They were still looking to him, their leader, for a miracle he could not provide. He had led them here. Their trust was absolute and in his mind absolutely betrayed. They're massing for a final push," Reaper yelled, pointing towards a deep shadow where dozens of enemy fighters were gathering. "This is it, Lead." At the same moment, Doc's voice came over the comm, choked with finality. "He's gone, Marcus. Joker's gone." The words hit Thorne harder than any bullet. The last flicker of hope died. He looked at the closing shadows, heard the triumphant shouts of the enemy fighters, and felt the profound, soul-crushing weight of utter failure. He picked up the radio one last time, not for a miracle, not for a rescue, but as a final testament. His voice was no longer that of a commander. It was the hollowed-out whisper of a man defeated. "Valkyrie, anyone. It's over." A nearby RPG detonated, showering him with dirt and debris, and he finished the transmission with a gasp. "We're finished." Colonel Davis's order was a cage of cold, hard logic. "Disengage. Return to your designated patrol route. Acknowledge." It was a lawful command, a clear directive from a superior officer backed by tactical data that painted the valley as a suicide run. Every instinct for self-preservation, every ounce of her training, every rule in the book screamed at her to obey. To press her microphone, say, "Valkyrie acknowledges," and bank her aircraft away into the safety of the empty night sky. It was the sensible choice, the sane choice. But another voice lingered in her helmet, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. It was ragged, broken, and utterly devoid of hope. "It's over. We're finished." Those words were not a request for support. They were a death rattle. They were the sound of men who had accepted their fate alone in the dark, betrayed by the cold arithmetic of war. Ava closed her eyes for a brief second, the green glow of her instruments painting patterns on her eyelids. In her mind, the two voices were at war. The voice of the colonel was the voice of reason. It spoke of unacceptable risks of integrated air defenses, of the near certainty of being shot down by a shoulder-fired missile. It reminded her of the cost of her A-10, of the years of training invested in her. It warned of the consequences of disobedience, a court-martial, the stripping of her wings, a life of disgrace. Obeying was her duty. The voice from the valley, however, spoke a different language. It was not a language of regulations or probabilities, but of a fundamental unspoken pact. It was the soldier's covenant, the promise that you do not leave your own to die while you still have fuel in your tanks and rounds in your gun. She had chosen to fly the Warthog not for its speed, but for its purpose. The entire aircraft, from the titanium armor that formed a bathtub around her cockpit to the monstrous 7-barreled cannon in its nose, was designed for one reason: to stand with the troops on the ground when no one else could. To fly away now would not just be disobeying an order, it would be a betrayal of the very soul of her machine. She looked out at the vast, indifferent blackness beyond her canopy. She was one person, a tiny speck of life and consciousness, suspended between the cold stars above and a savage fight below. Davies, sitting in his climate-controlled command center, saw the SEALs as acceptable losses, icons on a screen to be erased. He was making a calculation, but Ava was here on the edge of the storm, and she heard not data, but the final testament of dying men. For her, it was not a calculation. It was a choice. Her conflict did not end in a flash of revelation. It simply dissolved. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in command. The debate was over. The logic of her conscience had overridden the logic of her orders. Thorne's final words echoed one last time, and in their finality, they gave her clarity. Inaction was a decision in itself, a decision to be complicit. A profound, chilling calm settled over her. The storm in her mind ceased. All that remained was purpose. Her movements became deliberate, stripped of any hesitation. Her gloved hand moved past the communication panel, ignoring the blinking light that demanded her acknowledgement of the colonel's command. Her fingers found a small, shielded toggle switch on the armament panel. It was painted red, the color of warning, the color of finality. She flipped the plastic shield up and pushed the switch underneath. A single, audible click echoed in the quiet of the cockpit. The master arm switch was now on. The jet's weapon systems were live. The sound was small, almost insignificant, yet it was louder than any explosion. It was the sound of a line being crossed, of a choice being made. The Valkyrie had chosen the slain. Now she would choose who did the slaying. In the Tactical Operations Center, The final transmission from Trident Lead landed with the weight of a coffin lid slamming shut. "It's over. We're finished." The words chewed by static were nevertheless perfectly clear in their meaning. A heavy, somber silence fell over the room. The controllers and analysts who moments before had been a whirlwind of activity now stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of their screens. On the main tactical map, the 6 friendly icons representing Trident Team pulsed for a moment, then blinked out, replaced by a single red cross denoting a total loss. Colonel Davies stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. He had made a command decision based on risk and probability, and the outcome had proven his grim calculus correct. But the cold logic did little to warm the frozen space where the men's lives had been. He cleared his throat, his voice a harsh, gravelly thing that cut through the silence. "Log the time," he commanded the duty officer. "Mark callsign Trident as KIA lost in action." He then turned his attention to the remaining loose thread. His eyes narrowed at the tactical display. "And where the hell is Captain Rostova? Get me that pilot. I gave her a direct order to disengage. Why has she not acknowledged?" The comms officer shook his head. "No response on the command channel, sir. Still trying." Miles away in the solitary confinement of her cockpit, Eva Rostova was not listening to the command channel. She was listening to the thrum of her engines and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Her decision had been made, and the time for half measures was over. She was now a rogue element, a ghost in her own machine, operating outside the bounds of lawful orders. She switched to a secondary encrypted channel, one used for intra-flight communication. "Valkyrie 2, this is Valkyrie 1, how copy?" The voice of her wingman flying a parallel patrol 50 miles to the north came back instantly. "Solid copy 1. What's your status?" "Valkyrie 2. I'm showing a critical avionics fault." Eva said, her voice a perfect imitation of professional calm, laced with just the right amount of urgency. It was a lie, clean and simple, a well-known pilot's excuse to get off the net. "My primary systems are failing. I'm going dark and returning to base. You have the watch." "Copy that one. Good luck," her wingman replied, oblivious. Before he could ask another question, Eva severed the link. She reached up and systematically shut down all of her transponders and non-essential communication links. One by one, the connections to the outside world were cut. The cockpit fell into an eerie, profound silence, broken only by the hum of the aircraft itself. She was alone now, truly alone. With a steady hand, she pushed the control stick forward and to the left. The Warthog, never a nimble creature, responded with a heavy, deliberate roll. Its broad wings canted until the cold stars were below her and the dark, wounded earth was above. And then she dived. The aircraft didn't slice through the air. It fell through it, a 10-ton sledgehammer dropped from the heavens. The altimeter began to unwind at a furious pace. Warning chimes began to sound gentle at first, then rising to a frantic, insistent shriek as the ground proximity sensors screamed at her. She calmly flicked a switch, silencing them. Back in the tow sea, a radar technician stared at his screen in disbelief. "Sir, Valkyrie 1 just dropped off the scope. Her transponder is off and she's gone below our radar horizon." "What was her last heading?" Davies demanded, his voice dangerously low. The technician swallowed hard. "Sir, her last trajectory was on a direct course for Kilo 9 or 7. She was diving. Fast." A wave of fury and astonishment washed over the colonel's face. In an act of utter suicidal defiance, his A-10 pilot, his female bus driver, his scarecrow, had ignored his command and was plunging headfirst into a designated kill zone. She had gone to war. The moment the A-10 dropped below the ridgeline, the world changed. The vast open sky vanished, replaced by the suffocating proximity of rock and shadow. Eva was no longer flying over the battlefield. She was inside it. The roar of her engines, once dissipated into the vastness of the atmosphere, now echoed back at her from the canyon walls, a deafening, claustrophobic sound. Through her night vision goggles, the landscape was a terrifying panorama of glowing green and absolute black. She was flying through a tunnel carved by a god of chaos. This was flight at its most primal level, a brutal ballet of instinct and machine. The ground was a lethal high-speed blur just feet below her landing gear. Ancient pine trees, their branches like skeletal fingers, clawed at her wingtips as she weaved the heavy aircraft through the serpentine twists of the valley. Her hands were a constant blur of motion on the stick and throttle, making 1,000 micro-corrections a minute, not flying the plane so much as wrestling it into submission. A sudden wind shear pushed her sideways, and the port wingtip sheared through the top of a dead fir tree with a percussive thump that jolted the entire airframe. She didn't flinch, merely corrected the bank and pushed deeper into the ravine. Fear was a cold, hard presence in the cockpit with her, but it was a passenger, not the pilot. Her mind had walled it off, sacrificing all extraneous thought and emotion to the altar of pure, unadulterated focus. Her consciousness was a fusion of human and machine. Her eyes flicked from the glowing symbology of her head-up display to the ghostly green world outside her brain, processing the flow of altitude airspeed and terrain data with inhuman speed. She was not thinking. She was reacting, her body and the 10-ton machine strapped to her back moving as one. She was using the winding path of a long-dead river as her guide, a treacherous frozen scar at the bottom of the canyon. This kept the massive bulk of the mountain between her and the suspected locations of the manpads teams on the high ridges. They were looking for threats in the sky, not a monster creeping along the floor in the dark. As she neared the target grid, she could see the evidence of the battle above. Arcs of green tracer fire stitched the sky high over her head, a deadly web being woven around the SEAL's last known position. The enemy was confident, massing for the final kill, completely oblivious to the angel of death roaring towards them from below. She banked the Warthog hard around a final granite outcrop, the G-force a crushing weight on her chest, her vision momentarily tunneling. As the plane leveled out, the narrow canyon walls fell away, and the battlefield opened up before her. It was a scene from hell's own imagination. At the center of a shallow basin, a tiny cluster of rocks spat defiant, sporadic muzzle flashes. Converging on that last pocket of resistance was a storm of enemy fire from 100 different points, a swirling constellation of death. She could see the figures of enemy soldiers moving and closing the net. They were moments from being overrun. Eva's gaze locked onto the scene. The chaos resolved into a perfect, clear, tactical picture. The hunters and the hunted. The dying and the dead. The grim calm in her mind sharpened into a razor's edge. Her thumb moved to the weapons control stick, hovering over the trigger for the GAU-8 Avenger. The Valkyrie had arrived. A single word, cold and clear, formed in her mind. Marcus Thorne ejected his last empty rifle magazine and let it fall into the dirt. He drew his sidearm, the pistol feeling like a child's toy in his hand. Across their small, desperate perimeter, Reaper gave him a grim, final nod. The enemy was moving a wave of dark shapes surging forward from the shadows for the final, overwhelming assault. This was it. The end of Trident Team. He raised his pistol, took a breath, and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. It was then that he heard it. It wasn't the familiar crack of rifles or the crump of mortars. It was a new sound, A deep, guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the canyon, a vibration felt in the teeth and bones before it was registered by the ears. It grew exponentially from a whisper to a rumble to a deafening, soul-shaking howl that drowned out all other noise. "What the hell is that?" One of his men yelled, his voice thin against the impossible sound. They all looked up, scanning the sky out of sheer, hopeless reflex. They saw nothing but the cold, indifferent stars. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. From the darkness at the mouth of the valley, a shape erupted into view. It was not a graceful fighter jet descending from on high. It was a monster, a winged beast of prey that clawed its way into the air from the canyon floor. Low, wide, and brutally ugly, the silhouette of the A-10 Thunderbolt II was unmistakable in the green monochrome of their night vision. It was flying so low that for a split second Thorne could see the faint glow of the cockpit instruments. They stared, paralyzed by a mixture of shock terror and a wild, burgeoning disbelief. In the cockpit, Ava's world had narrowed to the glowing green rectangle of her head-up display. The largest concentration of enemy fighters, the tip of their final assault, was perfectly bracketed in her targeting pipper. She was flying at less than 500 feet, a criminally low altitude that put her squarely in range of every weapon on the battlefield. She was the perfect target and the perfect predator. Her thumb moved to the red trigger on her control stick. A lifetime of training, a career of quiet professionalism, a single defiant choice, it had all led to this single, irrevocable moment. She squeezed. From the ground, the world simply ended. The sound of the A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon firing was not a sound. It was a cataclysm. A solid pillar of 30mm shells glowing like a torrent of molten steel erupted from the nose of the aircraft. The air itself seemed to rip apart under the strain of 70 rounds per second. The ground where the enemy had been charging erupted in a continuous rolling explosion, a line of geysers made of dirt, rock, and men. The shockwave, even from 100 meters away, hit the seals like a physical punch, and the iconic brrrrt was a noise so violent it felt like it could tear a man's soul from his body. The entire Warthog shuddered around Ava, a violent, bone-jarring vibration as the immense gun did its work. The cockpit filled with the sharp, acrid smell of burnt propellant, a scent that meant life for the men below and absolute annihilation for their enemies. For 2 glorious, terrible seconds, she held the trigger down, erasing the enemy assault from existence. Then she stopped. The gun fell silent. The A-10 screamed over the SEAL's position, its engines a triumphant roar in the sudden ringing silence. The enemy attack had not just been stopped, it had been vaporized. The survivors were stunned, terrified, their chain of command, and their courage shattered in a single brutal pass. Ava pulled back on the stick, the G-forces a welcome weight, as she climbed, banking hard, to turn her sledgehammer around for another strike. On the ground, Marcus Thorne slowly lowered his pistol, his hand trembling not with fear, but with a raw, savage hope he had thought was gone forever. He watched the dark shape of the plane ascend, a black angel turning against the stars, and knew with chilling certainty that this was not a rescue. This was a reckoning. The first gun run had been a thunderclap of shock and awe, a blunt instrument to break the enemy's charge. Now the real work began. As Ava completed her high G turn, her eyes were no longer on the battlefield as a whole, but on the magnified high-contrast thermal image displayed on her multifunction screen. The enemy was no longer a charging horde, but a collection of terrified survivors scrambling for cover in the fortified positions that had moments before been their strength. Her job was to systematically take them apart. Her targeting pod automatically slaved to to the most significant heat signatures. The first was a heavy machine gun nest dug into a rocky overhang on the ridge, the very same position that had pinned the SEALs down with such devastating effect. The cannon's 30-millimeter rounds would only chip away at its granite fortifications. She needed something more. On the ground, Marcus Thorne understood instantly. This was no longer just their fight for survival. It was a coordinated hunt, and they were the spotters. "Reaper," he yelled, his voice raw with adrenaline. "Mark that nest sector 4 high-use tracers." Reaper, moving with a newfound savage purpose, sighted his rifle. He didn't fire a volley, but a single precise 3-round burst. A thin, brilliant red line of tracer fire streaked across the valley and hammered into the rock face just beside the machine gun's firing slit. It was a perfect mark. Ava saw it immediately. "Got it," she whispered to herself, her voice a low hum in the cockpit. Her fingers flew across the weapons control panel, selecting an AGM-65 Maverick missile from the pylon under her left wing. The screen flickered, displaying the grainy black and white view from the missile's own seeker head. A crosshair appeared, which she slewed directly onto the spot designated by Reaper's tracers. A high-pitched tone in her helmet confirmed the lock. "A missile away," she said to no one. A heavy clunk was followed by a roar as the Maverick ignited, leaping away from the aircraft on a plume of white smoke. The SEALs watched it, a fiery javelin crossing the dark valley in seconds. Ava watched its detached clinical view on her screen as it closed the distance. The impact was silent in her cockpit, but visually absolute, a brilliant white flash that momentarily whited out the sensor, followed by a secondary explosion as the nest's own ammunition cooked off. A deep, concussive boom rolled back across the valley a moment later, a full stop at the end of a deadly sentence. Threat 1 eliminated. Her next target was a mortar pit tucked into a depression on the valley floor. She had spotted its heat signature just as it launched a final desperate round. Before Thorne could even give an order, Ava was already rolling in. This target called for the gun, but not for the wild spray of before. This called for a surgeon's touch. She lined up the pipper, her approach steep and fast. For a single precise second, she squeezed the trigger. The brrrtia was short, sharp, and focused, a concentrated chainsaw of depleted uranium that ripped the mortar team and their equipment to shreds. That was the breaking point. For the scattered enemy survivors, this was no longer a battle. It was a supernatural execution. They were being hunted by a demon that flew below the trees, a creature that struck with lightning and a voice of thunder. Their morale shattered completely. They abandoned their positions, their heavy weapons, and ran desperate to escape the valley of death. Ava made one final pass, slower this time, a grim victory lap. She scanned the valley from end to end with her sensors. The frantic hostile signatures were gone. All that remained were the smoldering husks of destroyed equipment, the cooling bodies of the dead, and one small, defiant cluster of 5 white-hot shapes in a circle of rocks. They were alive. Her fuel warning light, which had been blinking insistently, now glowed a steady, angry red. Her work here was done. The battle for the valley was over. The battle for her career and her freedom was just beginning. The silence that fell upon the valley was more profound than the preceding violence. It was a dead, hollow quiet, punctuated only by the pop and crackle of burning debris and the high-pitched ringing in the SEAL's ears. Marcus Thorne pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind struggling to process the transition from certain death to impossible survival. He looked out from their rocky sanctuary upon a scene of absolute carnage. The ground was blackened and torn, littered with the wreckage of enemy positions. The sheer, focused destruction was biblical. He did a quick visual check. Reaper Doc and the two other remaining members of his team were getting to their feet, their movements slow and stunned. They were alive. The relief was a staggering, intoxicating wave, but it crashed immediately against the hard shore of their loss. Doc was kneeling beside Joker's still form, gently closing his eyes. They had survived, but they had not been saved from grief. Their collective gaze drifted upwards. The A-10 was still there, circling above them in a slow, protective orbit. It was no longer an ugly, obsolete aircraft. It was a guardian, a dark angel whose terrible beauty had granted them their lives. It was in that moment the most magnificent thing any of them had ever seen. Thorne knew with absolute certainty that the pilot of that aircraft had just thrown away their career and possibly their freedom for them. An acknowledgement was required, something more than a formal after-action report. He picked up his short-range radio, the one he had used to broadcast his final hopeless words. He keyed the microphone, his thumb unsteady. "Valkyrie," he began, his voice raspy. He paused, the formal language of military communication feeling utterly inadequate. "You glorious bastard. You got a solid copy on that?" In the cockpit, Eva was flying on autopilot. Her mind a maelstrom of adrenaline exhaustion and the cold, creeping dread of the consequences that awaited her. She was calculating fuel, planning her return flight, and preparing the speech she would give at her court-martial. Then a voice burst from her headset, crackling with static but alive with emotion. It was Thorne's voice, but it was not the defeated whisper she had heard before. It was a voice resurrected. "You glorious bastard." The words sliced through her professional detachment and struck her square in the chest. It wasn't a commendation or a thank you. It was a raw, unfiltered statement of profound soldier-to-soldier respect and acknowledgement from one warrior to another offered across the void. A single deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips, a release of tension she hadn't even been aware she was holding. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the truth of what she had done. It had been the right thing to do. Thorne's voice returned a moment later, the awe replaced by the clipped efficiency of a commander retaking control. "Valkyrie, this is Trident Lead. Status is 5 men standing 1 KIA. We are black on ammo and our primary exfil is compromised. Can you relay a message to Watchtower? We require immediate alternate extraction. The enemy may have reinforcements." The request sharpened her focus. Saving them from the firefight was only half the battle. They were still trapped deep in hostile territory. Her fuel light was no longer a warning. It was a final demand. She could turn back now, report her actions, and leave their fate to the command structure that had already abandoned them once. Or she could see it through to the end. There was no real choice. Not anymore. She took one last breath of defiance, a quiet moment of preparation for the storm she was about to unleash upon herself. Her fingers moved with steady purpose, switching her radio frequency from the private tactical channel back to the main command network. She knew Colonel Davies would be on the other end, waiting like a patient predator. She pressed the transmit button, and her voice, calm and clear, cut through the silence. "To stand by, Trident Lead." She paused, then addressed the Hornet's Nest directly. "Watchtower, this is Valkyrie 1, how copy?" The sound of Eva Rostova's voice broadcasting on the command frequency hit the Tactical Operations Center like a defibrillator shock. Controllers stared at their speakers in disbelief. They had logged her as a rogue asset likely lost, and the SEALs as confirmed KIA. Now here she was, her voice as calm and steady as if she were reporting local weather conditions. Colonel Davies's face, which had been a mask of grim acceptance, cycled through shocked confusion and then settled into a shade of incandescent fury. He snatched the Master Comms handset from its cradle. Valkyrie 1. He snarled, his voice a low, dangerous weapon. You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't personally have you arrested the moment you step out of that cockpit. Give me a situation report. Now. Eva's reply was devoid of any defensiveness. It was the epitome of military professionalism, a report so clean and concise, it was an insult in its own right. Watchtower, be advised, call sign Trident is alive and combat effective at grid Kilo 9er7. 5 members are standing. They have sustained 1 KIA. The significant enemy threat in the valley has been neutralized with my assistance. The colossal understatement hung in the air, thick with unspoken defiance. She hadn't just assisted. She had single-handedly rewritten the outcome of a battle that command had already declared over. The tactical reality in the talk shifted on its axis. The red cross marking the SEAL's demise was now a blinking yellow question mark. A mission that had been a catastrophic failure was now a potential success, albeit one born from an unprecedented act of insubordination. Davies was trapped. He could not in good conscience or with any political cover abandon the team a second time now that their survival was officially on the record. His jaw was a knot of granite. Stand by, Valkyrie. He bit out, then turned to his operations officer. Scramble the CSR package. I want 2 Pavehawks with armed escorts in the air 5 minutes ago. Get me a flight plan for an emergency exfil. The room, which had been a morgue, was now a hive of frantic activity. A rescue was being planned, a new mission born from the ashes of the old one. Davies turned his attention back to the radio, his voice still dripping with acid. Captain, your actions are the most profound breach of discipline I have ever witnessed. You are to hold your position and await the arrival of the rescue birds, at which point you will return directly to base and surrender yourself to the military police. Do you understand me? I understand, Colonel. Ava replied, her calm infuriating him further. However, my fuel state is approaching critical. I can provide overwatch for another 10 minutes before I must return to base. I will maintain this orbit until the CSR package is within range. She had checkmated him. He couldn't order her to stay longer than her fuel allowed, and he couldn't order her to leave the men she had just saved unprotected. All he could do was wait, stewing in a mixture of rage at her defiance and a grudging, sickening sliver of awe at what she had managed to pull off. 10 minutes later, the flight controller gave Ava the confirmation she needed. Valkyrie 1, be advised, Rescue 1 and 2 are now 5 minutes out from your position. Her job was done. She switched her comms back to the tactical frequency one last time. Trident lead, this is Valkyrie. Rescue birds are inbound 5 minutes out. I'm on bingo fuel. It's time for me to go home. Thorne's voice came back instantly, thick with an emotion that transcended simple gratitude. We hear you, Valkyrie. Godspeed. And thank you. Valkyrie out, she said, cutting the connection. Ava pushed the throttles forward. The Warthog, scarred and thirsty, responded, climbing out of the dark valley and banking east towards the distant lights of the airbase. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the past hour drained away, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. The fight was over, but the long, silent flight home had just begun, and at the end of it, a different kind of battle awaited her. The flight back was a journey through a different kind of darkness. The claustrophobic, high-stakes terror of the valley was gone, replaced by the vast, empty solitude of the pre-dawn sky. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses to a knife's edge had evaporated, leaving behind a weariness so profound it felt as if it had settled in her bones. In the silent cockpit, with nothing but the steady drone of the engines for company, Eva Rostova was left alone with the ghost of what she had done. Her Warthog was a wounded beast limping home. A yellow caution light for the port wing hydraulics blinked with a stubborn, annoying persistence, a souvenir from her encounter with the pine tree. The air scrubbers couldn't quite eliminate the lingering, acrid tang of the GAU-8's propellant, a phantom smell that would haunt her for days. The aircraft felt heavy-tired, as if it shared her exhaustion. Together, they had flown into hell, and the scars of the journey were written on them both. To the east, the first hint of dawn painted a thin, impossible line of violet and rose gold along the jagged horizon. It was beautiful, a serene, majestic spectacle that felt like a cruel joke. The world was waking up to a new day, peaceful and full of promise, indifferent to the fact that her own world had ended just a few hours ago. She watched the colors deepen, feeling an almost unbearable sense of detachment, as if she were a ghost, watching a world she was no longer a part of. She forced her mind into the familiar, comforting routine of a post-flight analysis. She replayed every second of the engagement not with pride or fear, but with the cold, critical eye of a professional pilot. The steep angle of the first gun run, the precise release point of the Maverick, the 1-second burst that had silenced the mortar. Her actions had been aggressive, unorthodox, and suicidal by the book. They had also been flawless. In the cold calculus of her own professional judgment, she could find no fault in her tactics. Given the same impossible circumstances, she would not have changed a thing, and that was the heart of the matter. She had upheld the unspoken duty of a warrior while shattering the explicit laws of a soldier. She thought of the court-martial that was now an absolute certainty. She could picture the sterile courtroom, the stern, unsympathetic faces of the senior officers who would sit in judgment, men like Colonel Davies, who saw the world in the black and white of regulations. They would speak of discipline, of the chain of command, of the catastrophic danger of a pilot going rogue. And they would be right. They would strip her of her wings, the silver emblem she had bled for, the symbol of her life's single greatest achievement. They would likely send her to prison. She had traded her entire life, everything she was and everything she might have been, for 5 men she had never met. Was it worth it? The question hung in the quiet of the cockpit. The answer came not as a shout, but as a whisper in the remembered sound of Marcus Thorne's voice. "You glorious bastard!" In the end, it was that simple. She had made a choice, and she would stand by it. There was no regret, no desperate search for an excuse or a pardon. There was only a grim quiet and unbreakable peace. The distant, shimmering lights of the airbase appeared on the horizon. It was not a welcoming sight. It was the end of the journey, the place of her reckoning. She began her landing checklist, her hands moving with a steady, practiced calm. She reached for the microphone to make her final approach, call her voice perfectly, even betraying nothing of the storm within. "Chita Tower, this is Valkyrie 1, 10 miles out, requesting straight in for landing. I'll be shutting down on the runway." It was a quiet declaration. I am home. I am unarmed. I am ready. The wheels of the A-10 kissed the concrete with a gentle chirp, a landing far more graceful than the wounded aircraft had any right to perform. As Ava slowed the lumbering jet, the control tower's voice directed her away from the main flight line towards an isolated hardstand at the far edge of the base, a place reserved for emergencies and unwanted arrivals. She knew without being told that she was being quarantined. Under the harsh, sterile glare of the tarmac floodlights, her reception party was waiting. It wasn't her ground crew. It was 2 Air Force Security Forces airmen, their faces grim and professional, and standing ramrod straight in front of them was Colonel Davies. His fury was a palpable presence, a cold, rigid aura that cut through the warm desert night. Ava methodically went through the shutdown sequence. One by one, the systems that had given her the power of life and death were silenced. The whine of the avionics faded The hum of the hydraulics ceased. Finally, with a long, drawn-out sigh, the twin engines spooled down into an absolute ringing silence. The heart of the Warthog was still. She unstrapped herself, her movements unhurried, and pushed the heavy canopy open. The dry, familiar air of the base washed over her. She swung herself over the side of the cockpit and descended the built-in ladder, each step a deliberate final act. Her boots hit the concrete with a soft thud. She walked the 50 feet that separated her from the colonel and came to a halt, standing at perfect attention, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder. She did not speak. She simply waited for the verdict. Davies's eyes were chips of ice. "Captain Eva Rostova," he began, his voice dripping with venomous formality. "By my authority, you are hereby placed under arrest for willfully disobeying a direct order." He was cut off not by a sound, but by a presence. From the deep shadows of a nearby transport hangar, 4 figures emerged into the light. They moved with a shared, aching weariness, but with an unbreakable purpose. It was Marcus Thorne and the 3 other survivors of Trident Team. They were clean, patched up by the medics and dressed in standard-issue flight suits, but the brutal toll of the valley was etched onto their faces. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at Colonel Davies. They walked past him as if he were a statue and formed a silent, solid line directly in front of Eva, facing her. They stood as a barrier, a living wall of testament. Thorne's eyes met Eva's. In that single, steady gaze, she saw it all: the grief for his lost man, the exhaustion that went bone deep, and a profound, unshakable gratitude that needed no words. He saw in her calm defiance the pilot who had answered a ghost of a call, the woman who had traded her future for theirs. Slowly, with a precision that was absolute, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne raised his right hand to his brow in a salute. The other 3 SEALs as one mirrored the action. The gesture silenced everything. It was more than a greeting. It was a public declaration. A Navy SEAL officer saluting a junior Air Force pilot was a profound breach of inter-service protocol, an act of respect so deep it bordered on fealty. It was a verdict rendered not by a court of law, but by the court of combat. In that single silent act, they became her character, witnesses, her jury, and her vindication. Colonel Davies stood frozen, his words of condemnation dead in his throat. He could proceed, he could press charges, he could follow the regulations to the letter, but he had already lost. In the only court that mattered, the verdict was in. Eva felt the crushing weight of the past 12 hours lift from her shoulders. The threat of prison, the loss of her wings, it all became secondary. She had the only judgment she would ever need. Her own hand, steady and sure, came up to return their salute, her eyes locked with Thorne's. Under the cold, impartial lights of the tarmac, the 5 of them remained a pilot, and the soldiers she refused to abandon, locked in a silent, sacred bond, leaving the colonel and his rulebook to stand alone in the dark. And so we leave them on the tarmac, locked in a moment where honor transcends rank, and a shared ordeal forges a bond stronger than any regulation. The true conclusion of this story isn't found in a courtroom or a medal ceremony. It lives in that silent, profound exchange. At its heart, this narrative is an exploration of the warrior's unwritten code, the deeply human conviction that you do not abandon your own, no matter the personal cost. It's a testament to the fact that the most difficult and righteous decisions are often made in defiance of accepted logic, born from a place of empathy and duty that regulations cannot quantify. The story of Captain Rostova is a tribute to the quiet professionals, those whose valor is measured not in loud proclamations, but in decisive solitary action under unimaginable pressure. It is a reminder that respect is not given. It is earned in the fire, and that true strength is the courage to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. If this journey into the heart of duty, sacrifice, and unspoken courage resonated with you, and you seek more stories that explore the depths of the human spirit in the crucible of conflict, I warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel. There are many more flights to take and many more silent heroes to meet. Thank you for bearing witness. Fly safe.